Please make welcome Gabriel Lafitte. Thank you.
Firstly, let me apologise for the slightly awkward setup here. We're trying to video this for people who can't be here, so it might make your line of sight for a few people a bit awkward. The one little handout there, I don't actually have copies of the new book, unfortunately, even though the London publisher does have a distributor in Sydney, but at least there are little handouts, free flyers about those two publications which Alex just mentioned. And if anybody's really interested in understanding more about the sacred landscapes, the landscapes of solitude, as I sometimes think of them as, that where all the minerals are to be found, which is a topic we'll get to shortly, then you might find the book useful. But let's start off, since we've got twin topics and they both contradict each other and connect with each other, the twin topics of tourism and mining. Who would like to go to Tibet? I know there's a lot of people in the audience who've already been, but I just thought let's make this sort of slightly future oriented. Well, an awful lot of hands went up. I hope that I can live up to one of the words that Alex used, inspirational, and not just depress you with some of the fruits of research which I'm about to show you. So if some of the things that I say might be perhaps new to you, or might not seem to fit with the image that we've tended to have of Tibet, I hope that doesn't put you off, because as you probably know, the Dalai Lama himself, when asked this question, should outsiders go to Tibet given the current difficulties and the pain and the grief being experienced by Tibetans, that overwhelming sense of claustrophobia, that might perhaps be a good word to try and capture some of the current feeling, especially in Lhasa. And he always says, yes, do go. I mean, Tibetans do want connection with the outside world. They really appreciate it if people who have good heart, goodwill, a real desire to make some authentic connection with Tibetans do go, and of course are witnesses to what's going on. So, in other words, please don't let this presentation put you off. However, there are some quite dramatic new things that are happening, and the concentration on tourism means that for a start we are looking at massive new infrastructure that China is putting in place. Now, we're familiar, when I use a word like infrastructure, people tend automatically, I suppose, to think of hydro dams, power stations, highways, railways, things like that. And of course, as we know, China has been investing tens of billions of dollars in getting that sort of basic infrastructure of modernity in place. But there's a lot of other infrastructure needed if you want to convert Tibet into a modern economy that's integrated into the Chinese economy, and that is capable of fulfilling China's target of next year having 13 to 15 million tourists arriving in Tibet. Now, that's a pretty massive number, and perhaps they are not likely to achieve quite that number, but if anybody here has been to Lhasa recently, you will have noticed the extraordinary number of tourists, and I don't mean Westerners, I mean Chinese domestic tourists. Tourism can be something that has a very positive function of enabling people of different cultures to encounter each other, but it can also actually be constructed as an industry in a way that reinforces stereotypes and actually hardens attitudes. So this presentation will be an opportunity for you to decide which of those two directions tourism is going. So starting off with a picture of the replica Potala that was under construction in Lhasa a few months ago, and this is a photo taken while construction was still taking place. This is a photo of the more complete version. I mean, if I were to innocently say to you, what's this? I think almost everybody goes, oh, it's the Potala. Everybody knows that. It is the icon. It is the brand. It is, perhaps the one image of Tibet that just about anybody worldwide might recognise. This is actually the replica. This is on the other side of the Lhasa River, and interestingly, China has turned it around so that it faces north. Tibetan buildings classically face south. They face into the sun. As does the historic Potala, the palace of the Dalai Lamas, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But this Potala faces north, so in China's language, these two Potalas smile upon each other across the Lhasa River. You can see this Potala here just in the background in this long distance shot, and the distance shot actually, I think, gives you some indication of not only the location but also the importance of it, because this is, as you can see from the foreground, in an industrial district. The south side of the Kichu, the Lhasa River, was never developed by Tibetans, but now that it's bridged and now that Lhasa is growing and experiencing the same sort of booming economy that so many Chinese cities are, it needs to grow, and there are massive plans for it to grow. Amongst other things, it will become what in India would be called a massive godown, a warehouse district, a logistics hub for the transshipment of everything that China manufactures en route to Nepal and northern India, which will only grow as the railways are extended beyond Lhasa, in all probability to the Nepalese border. So for a whole host of reasons, not just for heavy industry but also for that sort of trading logistics industry, the south side of the Lhasa River is designated as a major industrial area, and it's therefore an area that most tourists never even visit because it's the last thing they want to see. Regarding Braybrook as a tourist destination in Melbourne. But the Potala up the back, and as you can see from this picture, it's actually got a fair bit of foreground land reserved for a theme park. And China has announced that the budget for the entire project, the replica Potala, took about $700 million to build. It was built in a great hurry. I'm going to skip most of the words. These are critiques written by some of China, Tibet's leading intellectuals by Werse. The main purpose for constructing this new Potala is as a massive theatrical prop, as you might say a three-dimensional stage cloth, to staging a grand opera, a grand romance of the moment 1400 years ago, 14 centuries ago, when Chinese princess married the Tibetan emperor, and in the Chinese version and in this operatic version brought civilization to Tibet. The Tibetans up until that point were very backward and primitive. They only knew how to nomadize, how to roam hither and thither, as they say in India, with their livestock. But Princess Wencheng brought civilization in the form of seeds, knowledge of agriculture, silks, fine clothes. So here we have one of the climactic moments of this new production, which is staged 180 days out of the year, right throughout the tourist season in Lhasa. And if you do decide to go to Lhasa, I certainly urge you to see it and to please take photos. These photos are actually published on official Chinese websites, and they are taken not from the Lhasa production but from the Beijing production. This production was first staged in Beijing in a theatre, and because it was in a theatre, the backdrop was simply of the Potala was simply a classic stage cloth, a painting of the Potala. But in Lhasa, the production is on a much, much bigger scale. We're talking of a cast of 600 people, plus dancing yaks and dancing horses, plus every sort of modern spectacular lighting, theatrical effect that we're familiar with from White Nights and the sorts of things that unite us around the world. This is Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. This is the grand romance. Everybody loves a love story, and this is the compulsory love that the Tibetan people have had for China for the last 14 centuries. That's the plot. That's the basic syllabus. That's the lesson that everybody needs to learn. So in that sense, the key person in this narrative is Princess Wencheng. Of course, Tibetans will tell you a rather different story, that 14 centuries ago the Tibetan Empire was actually at its height politically, and that Emperor Songtsen Gampo, having already conquered the whole of Tibet, including conquering the Burn kingdom of Shangshung, having subdued the Nepalese to the south, already had 2 or 3 wives from the different areas he'd conquered, and felt that he was powerful enough to demand of the Tang dynasty, one of the most powerful of Chinese dynasties, a Chinese wife. And there are many stories in the annals of both peoples of the to and fro and the diplomacy and the none too subtle trickery involved in this final outcome. But the final outcome was indeed that Princess Wencheng did take the long, long journey of many, many months across Western China and Tibet, and did indeed marry Emperor Songtsen Gampo. Whether that tells you something about the might and power of the Tibetans at the time, this after all was exactly the time when Buddhism was being introduced, and Tibetans revere her memory and have done so for the last 14 centuries, precisely because to them the most precious of all things that Princess Wencheng brought with her was a statue of the Buddha that to this day remains the most sacred of all the Buddha statues. Out of the millions of Buddha statues in Tibet, this is the most sacred of all and has the greatest power to purify the mind. But in the Chinese version, she brought civilization in the form of seeds and agriculture, so the Tibetans could cease being quite such primitive people as to rely exclusively on nomadizing. So the opera reaches its climax where the two finally get to fall into each other's arms, and clearly this is a story in which they all lived happily ever after. And this is the founding of the harmonious society that China talks about. This is the grand finale of the Beijing production, and as you can see, the Potala in the background is indeed just a cloth, but with the extraordinary technologies available today in Lhasa, the Lhasa production is, literally a spectacular in every possible sense of the word. So, tourism. This is one of the major new attractions, and only one of the investments in the infrastructure of tourism that China has invested in. If you look here at this map of the Tibet Autonomous Region, which is half of the Tibetan Plateau, half of the area where Tibetans live, these dotted lines are the new airports, the new hubs, the new transport destinations, the way in which Tibet has been imagined as a series of quick, hot, short flights so as to avoid the tedium of bumping along in buses on bad roads and taking far more time than the average middle-class Chinese on their Golden Week holiday has to do Tibet. So it's not only Lhasa that we're talking about. But here we see, fairly typical, ordinary, moderately affluent Chinese tourists on the Bakor, the pilgrimage circuit, around the holiest central temple of Tibet in the background, the Jokang, which is where that statue that Princess Wencheng now resides, and where Tibetans, as you may well know, often prostrate right across Tibet in order to reach it, in order to purify their minds. Now, the body language of tourists is something that is universal. I live in Healesville, at the Healesville Sanctuary, where I occasionally work. The same body language of consumption and an idle curiosity is there. There's nothing unique in it. But seeing nice young Chinese tourists holding up their shopping bags literally right outside the entrance of the Jokang is a sign of how Tibet has been reimagined. So the question that occurs to me is this just the natural workings of a market economy? Is this just sort of modernisation that basically is happening everywhere? I mean, is there anything particularly exceptional about the fact that this is happening in Tibet? Again, this is literally right outside the Jokang. The Jokang is the sometimes in English called the cathedral, the main cathedral of Tibet. And you can see that, like a lot of tourists, a certain stylishness. This is actually a picture of a drinking contest that was in official Chinese media only a week or two ago, and they very explicitly said this is in Lhasa. So Lhasa has become, according to some recent survey data, a favourite place not only for millions of Chinese tourists, but for honeymoons, for millionaires. Of all of the domestic destinations available to the rich, Lhasa ranks as number 4, coming after the more tropical holiday resorts on the south coast and the major shopping hubs of Shanghai and Guangzhou. Lhasa comes 4th. And this, of course, requires massive hotels. And some of the world's biggest hotel chains are now building in Lhasa. We don't actually know precisely what the Intercontinental Resort Lhasa Paradise, that's a bit of a mouthful, but that's its official name, is going to look like when it's complete by the end of this year. But this is another one in the same chain in a Tibetan area on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. And the developer, who's currently under arrest for suspected corruption in part of the current crackdown on corruption in China, has a great liking for blue, for tropical landscapes, and also for, when he opens his hotels, parking his entire collection of Lamborghinis and Maseratis and Ferraris out the front to display his wealth, which as a business strategy, as a way of signalling to the new rich of China that, hey, I'm really successful, by staying in my hotel, you might be successful too. And that's a psychology that works in China. This is literally one of the largest buildings in the world, which he opened recently in Chengdu on land acquired by dubious means, according to the indictment against him. But it hasn't stopped him. And this is photos of, this is again is Chengdu, I must emphasize, not Lhasa. But if you look at the scale of the construction, it gives us some indication of, again, China's new emphasis on spectacle, the spectacular. I mean, this is construction on the most extraordinary scale, designed to, and look at the size of that screen. And the sort of projections that you can throw up onto such an LED backlit screen on a scale that just sort of boggles the mind. So, again, these are all very quick shots of this same development, just to give you, just some basic indication of the aesthetic at work here. No doubt Lhasa won't be quite as dramatic, but China has had a dream for a very long time that it would be wonderful if modernity and growing prosperity and purchasing power would somehow enable us not only to access the world, but ideally find some wonderful heavenly realm within our own borders. And I think that's the attraction. So putting up, what is clearly a very old-fashioned propaganda poster, for a start, it's quite obviously from the days before the one-child policy, of all of these little Chinese cherubs in their rocket ship, zooming the heavens looking for some sort of paradise that looks remarkably like a sort of a Chinese Buddhist paradise, which of course can be found everywhere and nowhere in particular. But a modern version of this kind of paradise now exists. Here is another propaganda poster, but a completely different aesthetic. This is a propaganda poster that actually needs no words. This, I think, is a tribute to the art of Photoshop. This has got absolutely everything that China wants. It's the one with the lot. On the one hand, you've got everything that is indicative of the comforts and the security and the predictability and the safety that go with modern infrastructure. You've got bridges, you've got a train, you've got a hydropower dam, you've got a jet, and you've got a hotel over on the left-hand side, I think it is. But you've also got the eternal mountains, and you've got the green and the blue, and you've got the carpet of alpine meadow Tibetan flowers at the foot. So this has got absolutely everything, and it's that combination that I think is the lure. That's what really brings in the huge number of Chinese tourists. This is a department store, again, right next door to the Jokhang. And it's been there for years. Last year they decided to liven up sales by, how car yards often have those sort of inflatable balloons that sort of wave idiotically at you to try and sort of get in your line of sight. Well, these are inflatable plastic Chinese lions on inflatable plastic Chinese auspiciously coloured cushions or plinths. And again, right next door to the Jokhang, on the right-hand side of that picture is the Jokhang. The Tibetans don't mind at all. Here are two old nuns, happily having an afternoon chat, not in the least bit sort of troubled by any of this. But again, it's this combination of a real estate boom that turns the most sacred landscapes of Tibet, which Tibetans have always used, as I said before, to purify the mind, into objects of concern.